This is a webinar I have given before. It's always quite popular because I think regardless of your discipline, even if you're, a first-year doc student or a seasoned faculty member, I think that the challenges I talk about today are experienced by all levels of academic writers. And I'm joining you, I'm representing 3 of my companies, the Dissertation Coach, Dissertation by Design, and Academic Insight Lab. And I myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Jessica Parker. I am a serial entrepreneur. I'm deeply embedded in the academic community with my consulting companies, and I have a generative AI company. I am still an educator, so I teach Doctor of Health Sciences students at Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. Most recently, I've been doing research on generative AI and its capabilities and limitations in academic settings. I'm also a grant writer and I'm a strategic partner. So our consulting companies, we strategically partner with universities to help retain their graduate students. A little information about my companies. I'm going to give you this information quickly because I think it'll help give you some context about, what I'm bringing to the table. I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of graduate students at this point across all different disciplines. I started Dissertation by Design 5 years ago. We primarily work with professional doctorates, and that really stems from my health sciences background. And we help students really at all stages of the research process, from conceptualizing their ideas all the way to final editing and formatting. I also recently acquired the Dissertation Coach, which has been around since 2000. It was founded by Allison Miller, who was a close friend and colleague of mine. So when she decided to retire from the Dissertation Coach, it just seemed like an obvious fit. The Dissertation Coach, we work with graduate students from all disciplines, so not just professional doctorates like we do at Dissertation by Design. And so if you need help with any aspect of your dissertation or thesis, from conceptualization to editing, feel free to reach out to us. I also own Academic Insight Lab. This is a generative AI company I started last year after doing some research on generative AI and really seeing the potential for this technology to transform how we teach, learn, and do research. And so through my experiences teaching and working with graduate students as a consultant, and also now working with graduate students and even seasoned faculty building generative AI tools, I bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. I've kind of seen a little bit of everything in terms of what academic writing challenges are really most prominent in novice to seasoned academic writers, and what strategies work and what doesn't work. And so I'm going to share all of that with you today at a high level. So this is our agenda. I'm going to start off by talking about common academic writing challenges. We're going to talk a bit about navigating self-doubt, perfectionism, loneliness, and overwhelm, which typically comes along with not just being a graduate student, but it's also, these are really common experiences that even I had as an early career faculty member. We're going to talk about proven strategies for getting unstuck and overcoming those challenges, and then academic writing best practices. And this is going to be a bit fluid, so it's not perfectly structured this way. I'm typically going to talk about a specific challenge and then immediately introduce at least 1 or 2 strategies in order to address that challenge. So let's just kick it off with some common challenges. So I kind of have these in 2 categories. I think about it in terms of feelings, attitudes, and beliefs that you bring to the writing process. So these are very much internal. And some examples that I'll talk about today are negative authorial identity. I'll define that in a moment. Loneliness and isolation. The planning fallacy is a big one. Even I am still victim to the planning fallacy. I just recently was like, I'm going to wrap up this manuscript in 2 weeks, knowing that I have never wrapped up a manuscript that quickly, given the amount of work that was ahead of me. But it's despite all of that experience, I still fall victim to the planning fallacy. We'll talk about fear of feedback, how that affects us as writers, and I'll give you some very specific strategies about how to overcome some of those common fears. And then there's also this idea of just academic writing conventions and considerations. At the end of the day, I sort of have this worldview that academic writing is like a non-native, it's just like learning a new language. Just like non-native English speakers can struggle to learn academic English, even if you speak perfect English, learning to write well as an academic is also challenging. And so there's a lot of theories in second language learning that are very much applicable to our work when we teach academic writing. So we'll talk a bit about some challenges around organization and flow, alignment, establishing novelty, and argumentation. So I want to start by a quick poll. So give me a moment to find the poll. Kirsty, I don't know if you can launch it on your end. Oh, here we go, polls and quizzes. Okay, so I'm going to start with a poll about which of the following writing challenges do you most frequently encounter? So select an option that most resonates with you. So I'm going to go into more detail, but I have the definitions here. Negative authorial identity is feeling doubtful about your expertise or authority in your writing, and this leads to a lack of confidence. Loneliness and isolation, the planning fallacy, like I just talked about, consistently underestimating the time needed for writing tasks, and then fear of feedback. So this could be worrying about receiving critical comments, or it could be this idea of like you have perfectionist tendencies and you're afraid of putting your work in front of your chair or your supervisor and having that potential criticism. So go ahead and select one of those, and I'll just wait for the responses to come in, and then I'll share the results. Ooh, negative authorial identity is a big one. I'll go ahead and end the poll. Most of you have participated. So these are the results. So 37% of you, it really resonated with you, this idea of negative authorial identity. So feeling doubtful and about your expertise and having a lack of confidence associated with that. Loneliness and isolation, 5%. And then the planning fallacy, 26% of you, that really resonated with you. And then all of the above. So 26% of you really feel that all of these challenges show up in your academic writing practice. And I'm not surprised. I mean, there's obviously more challenges we could touch on, but these are the challenges that tend to come up again and again in the work that I do with my doc students and with our clients at Dissertation by Design and the Dissertation Coach. So let's start with negative authorial identity. So like I just said, this is really about feeling doubtful about your expertise or your authority in your writing. It doesn't necessarily have any correlation with your intelligence or with your familiarity with your field or your topic. But it does often lead to writing anxiety and low self-efficacy. And interestingly, there's research that shows that negative authorial identity has been associated with high incidences of plagiarism. That doesn't mean intentional plagiarism. It could be unintentional plagiarism. And there's some ways that this shows up in our writing. So it's like, what does this actually look like when you have a negative authorial identity? It shows up as having like a neutral stance, so not taking a stance in your writing. Using a lot of passive voice in the writing also is a sort of hint at this. Lack of synthesis, so really just overly summarizing, and then overly using quotations in your writing. And so there are other features, ways that this manifests, but these are really the most common ways. And there are things that you can do to start to feel more confident as an academic writer and address some of these issues that maybe you don't even realize are showing up in your writing, but are as a result of not being confident or not feeling that you have authority yet in your field or your discipline. So let's talk about how you can strengthen your authorial identity. There's a couple of ways that you could go about it. First is like really just starting to take time to learn the audience that you're writing to and disciplinary conventions. So if you're a brand new graduate student, then just immersing yourself in the field of learning about academic writing and the different sort of purposes of academic writing, the different conventions, the different standards within your field, writing with authority and developing a voice. And so how do you go about that? So committing to your ideas and taking a stance, using active voice. And this is something that's challenging. I remember when I was a first-year master's degree student and my supervisor was like, you have a lot of passive voice in your writing. And I was like, I don't even know what that is. So I don't want you to panic if you feel like you're not familiar with some of these concepts. That's okay. You can always learn and educate yourself. But yeah, using active voice is one way to start to develop that authority in your writing. Critically reading and evaluating the literature. So reading, not just to read, not just to say, I have to look at this article, I have to read it in order to talk about the findings, but actually critically engaging with it. And I'll talk about that, what that means in a moment. And then using a top-down approach to writing. So this is a very practical way you could go about it. And I'm going to share a slide on that in just a second, show you what that means, the difference between a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And then there's certain linguistic and rhetorical devices that you can leverage in order to start to take more of a stance in your writing, to start to develop your voice as a writer. And at the end of the day, these are all very intentional moves that you make. So even as an experienced academic writer, I never sit down and produce a perfect first draft. I know that I still have a tendency to write with passive voice. Also, when I'm writing, I'm not necessarily thinking deliberately about like hedges and intensifiers. That's something that I do when I go back in and revise my writing. And so I still very much believe in what Anne Lamott calls like the shitty first draft, just get it on paper. But if this is something that you struggle with, then you can intentionally go back and in the revision process, once you have something in writing, thinking about these strategies for strengthening your voice in your writing. So let's talk about what a top-down writing approach looks like. So a top-down approach is when you start with your own argument, when you have an idea of what your central claim or thesis is, and then you look at all of the evidence available, you examine it, you critically read it, you evaluate it, you organize it, and that's sort of working toward this idea of synthesis. And then you're situating your argument in relation to that evidence. And it looks relatively simple. It's in 3 steps. We all know that all of this is pretty complex. But the main difference here is that you're starting with your central claim or thesis in mind, as opposed to examining the evidence and then trying to come up with what your argument is, because that can be really overwhelming. That tends to be like when the wheels fall off the bus. And if you're in the midst of writing a lit review right now, and maybe you haven't fully conceptualized your topic, then you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you go in and you're just reading all of the evidence and you kind of get lost in the sea of evidence without any sort of overarching argument in your mind or thesis statement, then it tends to be really challenging. That's when you kind of lose your voice because you're allowing other authors sort of to speak for you. They're shaping your argument without you starting with your own argument. And so even if your argument doesn't feel clear in your mind, I can almost guarantee you that you have some sort of overarching thesis in mind before you even go into the literature. So take time to conceptualize that before going into the evidence. And that'll not only make your search of the literature a bit more efficient and productive, it'll also give you direction as you're organizing and evaluating that evidence. So this top-down approach is, I think, a very practical way to start thinking about developing your voice as an academic or scholarly writer. And then there's this idea of reading critically. I teach an academic writing course to like first semester PhD students, and we talk a lot about critical reading. Critical reading is interacting with the ideas that are presented. It's really time consuming and it's really hard work. And I think for that reason, a lot of students or even seasoned writers will tend to just skim because they're looking for a specific piece of information without actually fully engaging with the literature in front of them. And so this involves like really questioning things, connecting ideas together between different research articles, And then looking at the text as an idea rather than a truth. And this comes into play a lot, like in health sciences, where we use critical appraisal tools. So I'm constantly teaching my students, just because something is published doesn't mean it's the gold standard. It doesn't mean that it's the end all be all of whatever field or topic or question that you're answering. You need to engage and question everything. And once you start doing that, you will feel better positioned to develop your own stance in your writing. And ultimately, what's happening through critical reading is you're making new meaning. And that is what's necessary for you to get to synthesis, which is not just required for the lit review, but synthesis is also important for the introduction of a manuscript, for a problem statement. It's where you're making a new whole out of the parts. And it's really difficult to get there if you're not willing to sort of slow down and critically engage with the literature in a new way. And then there's also language. Language is a tool. So there are very specific like linguistic and rhetorical devices that you can use in order to strengthen your identity and your authority in your writing. These are just a few, but we have hedges, boosters, counters, and even reformulations. And so these devices can manipulate the language to convey ideas more powerfully and evoke emotions or persuade the audience. And so it's important to know the purpose of the writing and who the audience is. You have to be very familiar with the evidence in order to leverage these linguistic and rhetorical devices effectively. But it's very much what I would say is a part of the revision process. And so let me give you a concrete example of this. So I'm just going to give you a moment to just read this silently. It's quite a lot. And then I'll just point out a few features of the writing, and hopefully this really helps you see the power of leveraging linguistic and rhetorical devices in order to strengthen your voice in your writing. And so the first example is just a graduate student purpose statement. And the other is what you would expect to see in like a research manuscript written by a more seasoned academic writer who has honed their voice. So now that you've had a moment to look through this, I'm sure that it seems quite obvious after I've made these points about leveraging language in order to boost your voice and find your voice. But in this graduate student purpose statement, I mean, this is very typical. This is not a poorly written sentence, but it's what I would expect of a novice writer who hasn't yet found their voice in their writing, where they're just simply describing what they're going to do. They're not actually putting forth an argument. They're not taking a stance. They're not being specific. They're not being nuanced. And so this published purpose statement, I mean, this could be a paragraph that went through 15 iterations in order to get to this point. I don't know many academic writers who would just sit down and craft this exact like perfect argument in one paragraph. It takes time to get here. But the point here is that to realize that these linguistic and rhetorical devices are available to you, and you can learn about them, and you can strategically integrate them into your writing to help strengthen your argument, which in turn is going to help you really strengthen that authorial identity that I find that many novice academic writers struggle with. Okay, so we're moving on from authorial identity to another challenge, which is around loneliness and isolation. I think this really became apparent during COVID when so many programs went online, and now many graduate programs are fully online or they've transitioned away from hybrid to fully online. And so it's extremely common to feel lonely and isolated in the process of writing, even if you're a faculty member. Research a lot of times happens independently, and you can feel alone in that. And so this can make you feel disconnected from your colleagues, from your peers. It can lead to a lot of self-doubt and even anxiety and depression. Like there's quite a lot of research that talks about the mental health challenges that graduate students face, and loneliness and isolation is a big piece of this. And so this might seem very obvious to you, but joining a writing community. You can form a writing community with peers in your program, or if you're a faculty member, I can almost guarantee you that there's journal clubs or there's faculty writing groups that you can join. This idea of accountability is a really important part of this, especially when you're a grad student and you get to that independent stage of your research where you're not in coursework anymore, where you're really having to take the lead and have some agency over the process. And so joining a writing community where you're meeting and communicating with other academic writers can start to help you like understand some of the unspoken norms of academic writing. You can even learn a few things from others about how they're overcoming challenges. It will increase your confidence. There's like a lot of research that shows this. This is just me sharing this anecdotally. And then there's also the opportunity to get feedback at various stages of your writing when you're involved in a community. And I know Allison Miller, the founder of the academic writer space, she has a co-working writing community that's really wonderful, and it addresses a lot of these challenges that are very common in that independent research stage for graduate students. So now let's talk about the planning fallacy. I started out by touching on how, I mean, just recently I had a manuscript in front of me. I knew how much left was to be written, and I still give myself this impossible deadline. So the planning fallacy is just simply your tendency to underestimate the time it will take to complete a future task, despite having knowledge that previous tasks have generally taken longer. And so what tends to happen, and I can speak from experience because this is really fresh on my mind, is like I was disappointed in myself that I didn't meet my deadline. I was getting anxiety, even though it was a self-imposed deadline. I had set this deadline that was not realistic. In my case, it didn't read the rushed or sloppy work because I ended up just extending my deadline. But if you are working against a hard deadline as a student or a faculty member, then just knowing and really thinking through about how long it typically takes you to complete a project or a writing task will help you avoid some of these pitfalls, because rushed and sloppy work and poor decision making is obviously not what any of us want to put forth. But whenever we don't really take the time to think through, how long has it typically taken me in the past to complete this task, then you're just sort of setting yourself up for failure in the future. And what I typically suggest to my clients is that they track their progress and they start to create timelines. I know that there's even some graduate programs now that require their students to update, documents with their progress. It's not just so that their committee can keep an eye on them. It's actually really helpful for you as a student in order to really think about what you need to do, how long you have to do it. And then I suggest adding not just a targeted deadline, but an actual completion date. And that'll help you in the future when you sort of go back and you look at that progress tracker to think about what's going to be realistic moving forward, especially if, a committee member or a peer reviewer asks you to turn something around. You can go back and look at this data, this evidence that you've collected on yourself to know what's going to be realistic for you so you don't overcommit yourself. Let's talk about fear of feedback. This is a big one. So fear of feedback can manifest in several ways. It's like resistance to even submitting a draft. It can be a feeling of inadequacy. You might feel overwhelmed about the idea of just receiving feedback. And typically what we see in graduate students, or even a faculty member who's submitting a manuscript and we've gone through a few iterations of like peer review, is this feeling of like, I am done. I am not touching this manuscript again. I don't want to look at it. And so you have this resistance to maybe even submitting the document again for feedback. There's also this idea of anxiety about there's an evaluation there. Our writing is very personal. And so it's very normal to feel anxiety about having your writing evaluated. There's also this affective state associated with getting feedback and having an emotional response, which also has a ripple effect. It tends to lead to a lot of procrastination, like disempowerment, discouragement. And so finding a way to navigate the feedback process is, I think, incredibly important. And I'm going to give you a few like very specific tools and strategies to give you a bit more agency so that when you do get that feedback, you feel that you're able to like jump into action instead of shut down. And so when we see some like common responses, and I see this a ton across the board with my own doc students and our clients, is like rushing through revisions. So not really taking the time to think through what the feedback says, what the comments are, working through the comments just top to bottom in a document. We can all probably relate to the moment where we received our document back from us with track changes and there's just comments and red lines on every page. And I think it's very natural to want to just start from the very first comment and work our way through, but that is not a good strategic approach for tackling feedback. So I'm going to give you a strategy for that, or just avoiding it altogether, just totally shutting down. And there's some strategic ways that you can think about this. So one is, I would say, considering your mindset. So if you're at dinner and you open your phone and you see the email that you've been waiting for, that might not be the best time to open up the attachment and look at the feedback that you've received. Like if you're not in the position to process it in that moment, then don't open up the email or the attachment. Because your mindset, when you receive that feedback initially, is going to come into play in how you react and how you respond to it. So make sure that you're in a good position to receive the feedback. I know it sounds simple, but it's important. Viewing feedback as neutral. Think of feedback as coming from this neutral third party. It's a clue about what you need to do to move forward. It's not a judgment of you or your worth or your intelligence. It's just this neutral piece of information about exactly what you need to do in order to take the next step forward and have that manuscript published or that draft approved by your chair or your supervisor. Using a reviewer response table is also incredibly useful. I'll show you one of those in a moment if you're not familiar with what that is. And then developing an action plan. So the action plan that I use with my clients and my doc students, what I recommend to them when I give them feedback, is to create an action plan based on these three categories. So if you get a document with quite a few comments, categorize the comments in these different categories. So organization, you could think of this as organization, like flow, structure. Comments related to content, which would be comments that require you to like go back into the literature, add content, revise your arguments. So thinking about actually engaging with the words and the ideas and the concepts and the argument that you're putting forth. So engaging with the evidence. And then editing. So anything related to grammar, style, punctuation, syntax. I would always save any editing comments for last, because it doesn't really make sense to like perfect a sentence or think about a comma if that sentence might be deleted or moved elsewhere. And so I always start with organizational type comments first, which might be a comment that's asking me to consider restructuring my lit review. Maybe your supervisor is questioning the headings in your lit review, or why do you have two sections on the same topic in different sections of a document? Those are sort of organizational type comments that would require you to rethink the structure of the writing. And then I said content. That requires you to go back into the literature and find evidence. And oftentimes what's happening is you're going back and forth between organizational and content comments, but you always save the editing comments for last and try to address one category at a time. It's not a perfect process, but I find that this is a simple action plan and it allows you to jump into action instead of feeling just incredibly overwhelmed and shutting down and not really knowing where to start. And then this goes to my generative AI company. Like getting formative feedback from AI, I think is a really good idea. It's not cheating. It's not plagiarism to get feedback. So I could talk about this, for days. It's another subject, but I'm just going to touch on the use of generative AI for formative feedback. I'm not talking about using ChatGPT to write or revise for you. I'm talking about asking for feedback from a generative AI tool in order to give you some guidance and help you like close the gap on your own before you even submit an assignment or a manuscript for review. And so this is just a screenshot. It shows some feedback that one of our AI tools provides. There are other AI tools on the market that can do this. But essentially, these tools are prompted to give you feedback for a very specific use case. So for example, this is an AI tool that gives feedback on a purpose statement. So it considers your study methods, your variables, your population, your setting. It gives you sentence starters for how to refine your purpose statement with very specific suggestions for improvement. So when you think of like a framework for this, it would be you doing all of the writing and the drafting. So these are all your ideas, but then you could use a generative AI tool to give you feedback so that you can attempt to address any revisions and close the gap on your own before submitting it to a peer reviewer or a faculty member. And these are just some like, this is like a bulleted list of what we consider good feedback practice even before technology. And the point I want to make here is that you can leverage technology to give you instant, high quality feedback that meets all of these standard definitions of what good feedback is. And then documenting in comments and revisions in a reviewer response table. This is usually something I would always do for a manuscript as a faculty member, but for whatever reason, I feel like this isn't talked about enough with graduate students. I require my doc students to use a table. So when I give them comments, we also do peer review. Usually at the end of the semester in their final submission, they'll send me a reviewer response table, which has my comments they receive from a peer reviewer. Now I let them use generative AI tools for feedback as well. So they're integrating like 3 different types of feedback, and they're organizing that in a table, and they're giving me their response. And so this isn't just helpful for the reviewer, it's also helpful for you to make sure that you are addressing every comment appropriately. And just through the process of organizing the comments and crafting a reply forces you to engage with the feedback in a deeper way, and usually will help you address the feedback better just through this process of getting it documented, getting it organized, and actually crafting a response is helpful just in general for the revision process. Okay, I'm talking fast, I'm looking at the time. I am going to launch another poll. I would love to hear from you now that we've talked about like a lot of attitudes and feelings and beliefs that tend to get in the way of our academic writing. I now like to think about like specific writing challenges that you've experienced. Kirsty, are you able to launch the poll? I'm not able to get it pulled up. Oh, here we go, it's showing up now. Let's see, poll 2. Okay, you just answer this question. There's obviously other options available, but when we think about challenges, I think about organization flow, argumentation is a big one, alignment, and establishing novelty. I did not give the option of all of the above here. I probably should have done that, but. Oh, this is pretty mixed. Organization and flow. Right, that's most of you. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results with you. Right, 48% of you said that organization and flow is a challenge that you experience pretty frequently. Argumentation, 24%. Alignment, I'm shocked. Only 5%. Usually that comes up a lot more. And then establishing novelty. Yeah, so argumentation, establishing novelty are pretty much tied. So I'm going to go into detail into each of these and then talk about strategies for overcoming these specific academic writing challenges. All right, let's start with organization and flow. So when I talk about organization and flow, like I was just talking about a revision and action plan for revision, about how organization is one of those categories. So sometimes when you get feedback that might say like, this is poorly organized, I agree that that is vague. That could mean a number of things, but typically it's about like the writing, the structure of the writing, which could be external structure. So you think about the headings, or it could be internal structure. So the way your paragraphs are organized and the main ideas are being communicated internally within a section of writing. This can be at the page, the paragraph, or the sentence level. And so what we do know is that a well-organized paper follows very predictable patterns. I'm going to talk about some of those patterns. The goal is to guide the reader. You want the reader to easily flow through the points that you're making without having to go back and remind themselves of a piece of information from earlier. It also conveys your focus and intent. So this is where your voice comes through as well. Like you're structuring your paper in a very intentional way. Because you have an intention. You are trying to persuade or argue for a certain point. You're also establishing expectations for the reader. A lot of times, especially in a dissertation or a thesis, it feels redundant, but oftentimes you're like telling the reader what's coming, then you give them the information, and then you're reminding them of what they just read. And you're starting out by establishing those expectations. You're establishing that structure from the beginning so that the reader knows what to expect. And this is why outlining is incredibly important, that planning stage before you start drafting. And so there are many different common organizational patterns that you can follow. The main point here is that you're intentional. And so you could look at like a situation, problem, solution, evaluation order, or maybe you're comparing and contrasting. Maybe you're looking at cause and effect or describing a process. Maybe you choose a thematic order or a chronological order. There's even more structures than this. The idea here is to learn and understand what those organizational structures are, and then take a step back and think about what is your argument? What are you trying to communicate? Who is your audience? What's the purpose of this piece of academic writing? And then what organizational pattern makes the most sense for you? This is where I really love using generative AI for brainstorming and ideation. I might go into ChatGPT and say, I am building an argument about X. I'm considering like a problem cost solution order, or maybe I'll just do a cause and effect order. Help me think about what that might look like. And so it's like I'm brainstorming with a peer, but I'm really just thinking about different organizational patterns before I sort of settle on an outline. Part of this is also directly related to critical reading. So the next time you read a manuscript or any sort of academic document and it's easy to read and it resonates with you, take a moment to step back and try to identify the organizational structure of that document. That's part of the process of emulating after other academic writers. And so if you start paying attention, you might notice that like the introduction section of many research manuscripts follow like problem cost solution, or maybe it's comparison and contrast. So just start paying attention and start analyzing that structure and thinking about, okay, well, how can I emulate that in my writing? Because I'm trying to make a similar type of argument. And then there's this idea of improving flow. So you think about this external structure, and then in the internal structure, you're also trying to accomplish flow. So the logical progression of ideas, so using topic sentences. The known new contract is also incredibly useful. If you're not familiar with the known new contract, just Google it. There's a lot of documentation on it, a lot of resources online. But the basic idea is that you start each sentence with what is known, and then you introduce new information. And then the next sentence picks up that previously new information that is now known and then goes to new again. So you're like strategically linking each sentence to the next using the known new contract. This is typically the approach that I take whenever I receive a document from a client or a student, and there's like too many main ideas in one paragraph, and I cannot follow their ideas at all. And sometimes it's like hard for me to pinpoint what the issue is. And typically I can trace it back to this idea of, okay, if we can implement the known new contract, then that's going to take care of a lot of these flow and logical progression issues. Becoming familiar with different transitional phrases available. There's a lot of information online, like you can use the academic phrase bank to explore different transitional phrases. There's also a wonderful book called They Say, I Say, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Look at what's available and just educate yourself on what different transitional words and phrases are used and what they're meant to accomplish. And then there's improving cohesion through repetition. So this is honestly, I think, the easiest thing that you can do to improve flow is really repeating the same key terms and concepts again and again to reinforce those ideas. So not getting out your thesaurus and trying to come up with a different word every time for a really important key concept in your study. You actually want to stay true to that exact wording and terminology. And by repeating those key terms and concepts, you're actually improving the cohesion of your document. All right, argumentation. I know that some people may argue that academic writing is not argumentative, but I definitely disagree. Having an argument doesn't mean that you're not objective about the evidence. Academic writing is definitely argumentative, but there's different levels of it. There's different stances that you can take in your argument. And so clarity and focus is really important. And so this is where, if you're building out a research study right now, conceptualizing, like really slowing down in that conceptual stage where you're thinking about what is your central thesis or your claim, some may call it. How are you going to build out that argument? And that's how you start building out a compelling structure for communicating that argument to whoever your target audience is. And so what poor argumentation looks like is too many main ideas. So if you think back to the beginning of this presentation, I talked about the top down versus the bottom up approach. Typically, when you start with the bottom up approach and you don't come into the literature with some idea of what your argument is, that tends to manifest as a poor argument where you're like throwing way too many ideas at the reader and they cannot follow your point. And that's because you're looking at the evidence first before you have a clear sense of what you want to say, which leads to a poorly defined central thesis. Typically, it also leads to alignment issues where the claims that you're making don't necessarily align with the evidence that you're attaching to those claims. And then not having a counter argument, not introducing an opposing view, which comes across as biased. If you're only introducing your viewpoint, then a counter argument is actually a major feature of a good argument. So let's talk about strengthening your academic arguments. So streamlining your ideas. So starting out with a single strong main idea. And it doesn't mean that your idea can't change. So going back to that top-down approach I talked about earlier, I'm not saying that you start with your argument and you can't change it once you see the evidence, but having some sense of what your central claim is before going into the evidence is really important. And then after you've looked at the evidence, really settling on a very specific and focused main idea for the overall piece that you're writing, whether it be a really long document like a dissertation or a research manuscript or even a grant proposal. Clearly defining it and making sure that it's not only specific, but thinking about how it's debatable. What could criticisms be? And then anticipating those criticisms and thinking about your rebuttal to those criticisms. And that's all part of clarifying your thesis statement. And then thinking about how your evidence supports your main idea. And then oftentimes when you're writing, you have your central claim, but there's also other subclaims that you're going to be making within the document you're writing, whether it be a lit review or the introduction to a research manuscript. And so there needs to be evidence to support not only your central claim, but also criticisms to that claim. So you think about the rebuttals that you would put forth and what evidence exists that would align and support those rebuttals. And that also comes into play with counter arguments. You need to think about the counter arguments in order to strengthen your position. And again, this is where I love using generative AI because it allows me to instantly explore a lot of different perspectives and consider different criticisms and opposing viewpoints and just brainstorming ideas for how that might affect my position. It doesn't necessarily change my original position. It usually doesn't, but it helps me strengthen my position because I'm able to quickly explore perspectives that are usually not immediately apparent to me. So not many of you touched on alignment, which surprises me because alignment is usually a major issue. So lack of alignment is, especially if you're a grad student or even an early career researcher, is one of the most common reasons why a research proposal is not approved. And alignment is the logical connection of ideas throughout a proposal or an entire research manuscript, not just a proposal. When you think about alignment, it can be at the word and the sentence level. It could be within your research question, the language that you're using to talk about, let's say you're doing a correlational study, but within your problem statement, the language that you're using speaks to, I don't know, uses language like how, which speaks to a process, which has nothing to do with a correlation. So at the word level, there can be alignment issues. We also think about precision in our language, like not being overly vague or descriptive, being as precise as possible, and making sure that you're using the correct terminology based on your field and your discipline, the research methodology and design that you're using, and understanding the implications of your word choices. I teach a research methods course to first-year doc students, and they love to throw around the word effect. And I talk to them a lot about what it means to use the words cause and effect in research, and how those words are very closely tied to experimental designs and how you don't just throw those words around when you're writing a proposal. And so all of that comes into play, that level of precision, when we think about alignment. I also think about consistency across the document. Something I very commonly see in research proposals is different iterations of a purpose statement or even a research question. So the key components of a proposal are your purpose statement, your research questions and hypotheses, if you're doing, quant or mixed methods, your problem statement. And so the terminology you're using, those key words and those key concepts and the key ideas you're putting forth need to be consistently communicated all throughout the document. So like a simple way to think about addressing that would be settling on your purpose statement and then copying and pasting it throughout your document and not introducing any variation in your wording, because that actually confuses the reader and it can lead to alignment issues in your writing. And so next is establishing novelty. So showing how your work is, this just means you're thinking about how your work is relevant, how it's new, how you're contributing to the discourse within your field. So some common pitfalls here, these are two that I see pretty frequently, is communicating an idea for a research study as an interest instead of really communicating why it's crucial for you to study. And then in line with that is saying there's no research on this topic. This study is needed because there is no research on this topic. And in response to that, I would tell a student, I would almost guarantee that there is some research on this topic, but even if there isn't, that is not a great direction to go in for a novice researcher. It's going to be really challenging to build out a research project on a brand new field of study. And so instead, think about how can you build your argument, that top-down approach, go into the evidence, find gaps in the literature or even patterns, and then how can you build on that with your research? And for something to be novel doesn't mean it has to be brand new and innovative and groundbreaking and never done before. It could be novel just building on an existing study, just extending that study to a new population and a new setting, changing up one variable. But the novelty is all in how you're communicating it by situating your study within the larger field of evidence. So really thinking through who cares, why should your audience care? Think of it as like an elevator pitch. Describing current practices in your field and why your solution that you're proposing might be new. That's one way you could think about approaching it. Really analyzing and evaluating the existing literature to think about what might be inconclusive or unsatisfactory. And then how do you fill that gap with your current research? And again, it doesn't need to be groundbreaking in order to be a valuable contribution to the discourse. Wow, I like landed the timing perfectly. All right, summary. We talked about common writing challenges, negative authorial identity, loneliness and isolation, the planning fallacy, fear of feedback. We talked about different challenges around academic writing conventions and considerations. We talked about a lot of different strategies, including reading critically, a top-down approach to writing, linguistic and rhetorical devices like hedges, boosters, reformulations, organizational patterns, and then a strategic process for responding to feedback using like an action plan or generative AI tools or creating a review or response table.